Chapter 21. Currents of Thought in the 19th Century. The intellectual life of the 19th century was more complex than that of any previous age. This was due to several causes. First, the area concerned was larger than ever before. America and Russia made important contributions, and Europe became more aware than formerly of Indian philosophies, both ancient and modern. Second, science, which had been a chief source of novelty since the 17th century, made new conquests, especially in geology, biology, and organic chemistry. Third, machine production profoundly altered the social structure and gave men a new conception of their powers in relation to the physical environment. Fourth, a profound revolt, both philosophical and political, against traditional systems in thought, in politics, and in economics, gave rise to attacks upon many beliefs and institutions that had hitherto been regarded as unassailable. This revolt had two very different forms, one romantic, the other rationalistic. I am using these words in a liberal sense. The romantic revolt passes from Byron, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche to Mussolini and Hitler. The rationalistic revolt begins with the French philosophers of the Revolution, passes on, somewhat softened, to the philosophical radicals in England, then acquires a deeper form in Marx and issues in Soviet Russia. The intellectual predominance of Germany is a new factor, beginning with Kant. Leibniz, though a German, wrote almost always in Latin or French, and was very little influenced by Germany in his philosophy. German idealism after Kant, as well as later German philosophy, was, on the contrary, profoundly influenced by German history. Much of what seems strange in German philosophical speculation reflects the state of mind of a vigorous nation deprived, by historical accidents, of its natural share of power. Germany had owed its international position to the Holy Roman Empire, but the emperor had gradually lost control of his nominal subjects. The last powerful emperor was Charles V, and he owed his power to his possessions in Spain and the Low Countries. The Reformation and the 30 Years' War destroyed what had been left of German unity, leaving a number of petty principalities which were at the mercy of France. In the 18th century, only one German state, Prussia, had successfully resisted the French. That is why Frederick was called the Great. But Prussia itself had failed to stand against Napoleon, being utterly defeated in the Battle of Jena. The resurrection of Prussia under Bismarck appeared as a revival of the heroic past of Alaric, Charlemagne, and Barbarossa. To Germans, Charlemagne is a German, not a Frenchman. Bismarck showed his sense of history when he said, "We will not go to Canossa." Prussia, however, though politically predominant, was culturally less advanced than much of Western Germany. This explains why many eminent Germans, including Goethe, did not regret Napoleon's success at Jena. Germany, at the beginning of the 19th century, presented an extraordinary cultural and economic diversity. In East Prussia, serfdom still survived. The rural aristocracy were largely immersed in bucolic ignorance, and the labourers were completely without even the rudiments of education. Western Germany, on the other hand, had been in part subject to Rome in antiquity. It had been under French influence since the 17th century. It had been occupied by French revolutionary armies, and had acquired institutions as liberal as those of France. Some of the princes were intelligent, patrons of the arts and sciences, imitating Renaissance princes in their courts. The most notable example was Weimar, where the Grand Duke was Goethe's patron. The princes were, naturally, for the most part, opposed to German unity, since it would destroy their independence. They were therefore anti-patriotic, and so were many of the eminent men who depended on them, to whom Napoleon appeared the missionary of a higher culture than that of Germany. Gradually, during the 19th century, the culture of Protestant Germany became increasingly Prussian. Frederick the Great, as a free thinker and an admirer of French philosophy, had struggled to make Berlin a cultural centre. The Berlin Academy had, as its perpetual president, an eminent Frenchman, Maupertuis, who, however, unfortunately became the victim of Voltaire's deadly ridicule. Frederick's endeavours, like those of the other enlightened despots of the time, did not include economic or political reform. All that was really achieved was a claque of hired intellectuals. After his death, it was again in Western Germany that most of the men of culture were to be found. German philosophy was more connected with Prussia than were German literature and art. Kant was a subject of Frederick the Great. Fichte and Hegel were professors at Berlin. Kant was little influenced by Prussia, Indeed, he got into trouble with the Prussian government for his liberal theology. But both Fichte and Hegel were philosophic mouthpieces of Prussia, and did much to prepare the way for the later identification of German patriotism with admiration for Prussia. Their work in this respect was carried on by the great German historians, particularly by Mommsen and Treitschke. Bismarck finally persuaded the German nation to accept unification under Prussia, and thus gave the victory to the less internationally minded elements in German culture. Throughout the whole period after the death of Hegel, most academic philosophy remained traditional, and therefore not very important. British empiricist philosophy was dominant in England until near the end of the century, and in France until a somewhat earlier time. Then, gradually, Kant and Hegel conquered the universities of France and England, so far as their teachers of technical philosophy were concerned. The general educated public, however, was very little affected by this movement, which had few adherents among men of science. The writers who carried on the academic tradition, John Stuart Mill on the empiricist side, Lotze, Sigwart, Bradley, and Bosanquet on the side of German idealism, were none of them quite in the front rank among philosophers. That is to say, they were not the equals of the men whose systems they, on the whole, adopted. Academic philosophy has often before been out of touch with the most vigorous thought of the age, for instance, in the 16th and 17th centuries, when it was still mainly scholastic. Whenever this happens, the historian of philosophy is less concerned with the professors than with the unprofessional heretics. Most of the philosophers of the French Revolution combined science with beliefs associated with Rousseau. Helvetius and Condorcet may be regarded as typical in their combination of rationalism and enthusiasm. Helvetius, 1715 to 1771, had the honor of having his book De l'Esprit, 1758, condemned by the Sorbonne and burnt by the hangman. Bentham read him in 1769 and immediately determined to devote his life to the principles of legislation, saying, "What Bacon was to the physical world, Helvetius was to the moral. The moral world has therefore had its Bacon, but its Newton is still to come." James Mill took Helvetius as his guide in the education of his son, John Stuart. Following Locke's doctrine that the mind is a tabula rasa, Helvetius considered the differences between individuals entirely due to differences of education. In every individual, his talents and his virtues are the effect of his instruction. Genius, he maintains, is often due to chance. If Shakespeare had not been caught poaching, he would have been a wool merchant. His interest in legislation comes from the doctrine that the principal instructors of adolescence are the forms of government and the consequent manners and customs. Men are born ignorant, not stupid. They are made stupid by education. In ethics, Helvetius was a utilitarian. He considered pleasure to be the good. In religion, he was a deist, and vehemently anti-clerical. In theory of knowledge, he adopted a simplified version of Locke. Enlightened by Locke, we know that it is to the sense organs we owe our ideas, and consequently our mind. Physical sensibility, he says, is the sole cause of our actions, our thoughts, our passions, and our sociability. He strongly disagrees with Rousseau as to the value of knowledge, which he rates very highly. His doctrine is optimistic, since only a perfect education is needed to make men perfect. There is a suggestion that it would be easy to find a perfect education if the priests were got out of the way.